The Ordinance Committee meeting of August 30th to order, and if we could start with a roll call.
Councilmember Jordan?
Here.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez?
Present.
Chair Snedden?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And do we have any changes to the agenda? Okay, and any public comment for items not on the agenda?
Not at this time, no.
Okay, thank you. Well, with that, we'll invite staff presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the Ordinance Committee and Chair. I'm Sarah Connect, Assistant City Attorney, and I'm going to be presenting the first item today, which are proposed changes to the Ordinance Committee, Ordinance Committee processes and chapter, which is contained in Chapter 2.05 of the Municipal Code. And first of all, I apologize for not having a PowerPoint today, but not a lot of pretty pictures that go along with this. The chapter was codified in 1972 and in Chapter 2.05 of the Municipal Code, as I mentioned, and many of the code provisions contained in that chapter are now out of date, and several of them haven't been followed in many years. So we wanted to take this opportunity, along with the Finance Committee codification, to change some of them and just bring them up to date to more reflect the practices of today's committee. Really, there are four important and major changes to the chapter, and I'll just walk you through them today. The first of which is that the existing code allows any single council member or one or more member of the Ordinance Committee, the city attorney, or the city administrator to refer a matter to the Ordinance Committee for review and consideration. The proposed ordinance would require a majority vote of the city council, the city attorney, or the city administrator to refer an ordinance or ordinance concept to the Ordinance Committee for review and deliberation. The second major change is that the existing ordinance grants authority of the committee to forward material to the city attorney with the request that the city attorney draft the ordinance expressing the substance of the legislation as the proponent of the ordinance would desire, and then as modified by the ordinance committee. The proposed change continues with that authority that the ordinance committee refer matters to the city attorney to draft a proposed ordinance, but provides the following caveat, that the proposed revisions, if they require significant additional legal research by the city attorney, that it be referred first by the ordinance committee to the city council for authorization. The third major change is that the existing ordinance requires the city attorney to forward proposed ordinances to the city administrator for a formal 30-day written comment period. And then the city administrator, if the city administrator provides written comments, those comments must then be deliberated upon by the ordinance committee. This hasn't been followed in any number of years. So the proposed ordinance would remove that requirement, and it still provides that the city administrator can comment and provide review of the proposed ordinance, but postpones that process until after final action by the ordinance committee, and takes out any formal written comment process or time period. And the fourth major change is that the existing code creates a 30-day deadline for the ordinance committee to deliberate on any ordinance. And if that, at the end of that 30-day period, if the ordinance committee hasn't concluded, any member of the ordinance committee or 3 city council members may cause the proposed ordinance to be referred to the city council to the next regular city council meeting for introduction. The proposed ordinance deletes that 30-day time provision. So those are the major changes that we've proposed. And of course, it's all up for your consideration and deliberation, and any questions.
Thank you. I know I have questions. Are there other committee members who have questions? No questions? No questions, okay. I'll start. So in the major change number 1, I don't have issue with. Number 2, I just have some questions about, has this been a problem? Or the second one about the proposed ordinance that they require additional legal research be referred by the ordinance committee to city council for authorization. It seems to me we've had multiple ordinances where they've come to us, like, I'll give an example, maybe ADUs or,
Right.
or something like that. And I'm going to use ADUs again as another example for a question, but where it's come to us and then we have needed more research, and it seems cumbersome to then go back to council when council has referred it to ordinance committee to go make your recommendations, come up with an ordinance, and come back when it's done. It seems an extra cumbersome step. So I'm sort of asking about what the impetus for this change is.
Right, Chair Sneddon, and I would have to say that having come into this late, I don't know exactly if it's a problem. I would just comment that it's probably a function of workload, and that, you know, maybe getting the council buy-in on going that extra process, considering the other workload issues that are before this, that the council has asked the city attorney's office to take on, maybe going back to city council to consider, you know, the timing, what else is on the plate, what those other issues are, would probably be the reason for that additional. And it would only come up in the case, for example, maybe the ADU or, you know, other things that would require a significant amount of additional work.
Well, tenant
Probably
protections.
not often.
Well, there's several, like tenant
Yeah.
protections was another, and there are times when council directs it to ordinance to basically go figure it out and spend as much time as you need to figure it out.
Right.
So I'm just a little bit wary of this one. I can see significant additional legal research, and that would be decided by the city attorney.
I think it would be decided by the city attorney, right, because only the city attorney would really know the scope of what is additionally needed.
So this could give authority to the city attorney to request that it go back to city council?
Yeah, and probably when those situations arise, the city attorney would come to the ordinance committee and say, you know, this has arisen to the level that I think it needs to be referred back to council for further authorization.
Okay, I'll make that recommendation, that it be sort of not automatic, but come
Right.
to ordinance to see if, well, maybe we don't need that extra level of research, if it's going to slow it down that way or that kind of thing, some kind of discretion. And then for the third change about the city administrator's comments, and if we could maybe have a discussion or have a question about when is it seems to me that it's valuable that the city administrator be given the opportunity for comments before we get too far, before we, spend a lot of time and effort with staff time and everyone's effort on an ordinance, that then at the end, we might hear from a city administrator that this is problematic and these are the reasons why. And this seems to be pushing that comment period to the end of that whole process. So again, I'm sort of questioning why, and maybe there's a better way to invite that formal comment at a different part of the process and not waiting until the very end. So it's a question about why this particular recommendation.
And to be honest, I don't know. All I know, the genesis of why it was felt that it was necessary to push it to the end, except for to eliminate that 30-day time period, and the requirement that that 30-day time period be in the middle of the ordinance committee review. But, it could be easily solved, I think, by, because the new language here says following final action by the ordinance committee. If we wanted, or if your committee wanted to, include that city administrator review more in the process of the ordinance committee, taking out that new language and just leaving it that the city attorney, and maybe not even having it shall review, but may review, if the city administrator has a desire to review, may review the ordinance as it's being considered by the ordinance committee, has that opportunity, but not required and not a time limit.
I like that very much, actually, because I think we want to get away from that. Maybe we're making an ordinance that's just not doable by the administration, and then we
Yeah.
haven't gotten that input until we've gotten all the way through the process. So if there is input to be had on that, it seems like we should get that before the very end.
Right. So that's
Yeah.
yeah. I'll make a note of that.
Thank you. And again, I mean, we'll take it to the committee to see
Right,
the recommendations. These are just what came up for me as I read this. And then, I guess going through, I don't have too many questions here, but just a couple. So on page 2, or I guess section 2.05050, section B, and it specifically adds exempting ordinances pursuant to state or federal, actually, it just says state or federal and doesn't say law or anything after that. But my question about that is what about something like the state ADU ordinance? It still came to ordinance committee for us to tailor it to our local community. So does this exempt ordinance committee from being able to? So I'm sorry, so 2.05050B,
Oh, B, sorry, I thought you said E.
sorry, B, under exempt ordinances. And it's added language to exempt ordinances relating to assessment proceedings adopted pursuant to state or federal, and it doesn't say state or federal what, like law or?
Chair Sneddon, the way I read the new language, it's ordinances relating to improvement or assessment proceedings, which would be improvement districts or assessment proceedings,
Ah.
which are adopted pursuant to state or federal law, and law is there, or an ordinance.
Okay, so it's,
So I think it's not state or federal, other kinds of laws.
thank you. When reading the underscore one, I didn't see the comma there, so that's read it differently, which is important. I thought maybe this was exempting us from looking at state or federal. Okay, so that's not an issue there. Thank you for answering that one. And then under C, in that same section, 2.05050C, and it says urgency or interim ordinances as authorized by law. And could we have that unless directed by council to look at somehow? Because we do urgency or interim ordinances, and sometimes, and I realize that's not an emergency ordinance, but we have before from council referred that to the ordinance committee to look at before coming back. So would that still be in the spirit of this change if it was unless directed by council?
I don't see a problem with that.
Okay, thank you. And then under,
Unless it caused a huge timing problem, but then that would be brought to council at the time they directed it to you, so, to ordinance committee.
yeah, I'm just trying to,
Right.
prevent,
Yeah.
stopping ourselves from directing it to ordinance.
Right.
And then on I think another similar unless directed by council, which ordinances in the opinion of the city attorney do not involve substantive revision or establishment of city legislation. I would still like council to retain oversight of that, I guess. And that was all for that one. I have other questions for the finance one, but that's the one for the ordinance. Are there any other questions or comments? Councilmember Jordan.
So, Ms. Kinnock, so that's a good wake-up call on the city administrator. So I'm just thinking of other examples where it's been a attorney and ordinance show, and then by the time it gets to the city administrator, she says, you didn't give me the money, or I don't have the money, or whatever it is. And so how does that get baked into the ordinance? Because right now you're just taking out that requirement. So how does that get baked into the ordinance so that he or she has an opportunity to see it and get involved and be welcomed rather than ask how does that happen? What's the process there? Or do we need to, and does he or she have that opportunity at any time, I guess?
Councilmember Jordan, so under the current configuration of the ordinance, which apparently hasn't been adhered to,
Right.
the city administrator is required to have this 30-day review period. So if that hasn't been happening, then it's not been adhered to. But under, what we're considering today, we would, as proposed, it would eliminate that process of it going to the city administrator until after it clears through ordinance committee. But as Chair Sneddon is proposing, we would remove that requirement that it be considered by the city administrator after,
Right.
and allow the city administrator the option to have input into the ordinance
So-
during the process.
So
If
I would
if
differ
the-
that it hasn't been a problem before, because it has been a problem. Ordinances have certainly been adopted only for us to then say, there's nobody to enforce leaf blowers, just to
Yeah.
pick an obscene example. So if you're just taking out which I agree, take out the requirement that we haven't been doing, but how are we baking in then so let's say today, just use today as an example. If the city administrator said today is an adoption of something that's encumberancing an expense that hasn't been discussed at council, we have no money for, we won't have resources for, but you're on the path to adopting that ordinance. After this is done, does that mean she sits down in here and provides input on that ordinance as long as it catches her eye? So there's no, you follow what I'm saying? There's
Yeah.
really no there was a structure before, which we're not following. We're taking the structure out because we're not following it and it's burdensome. So what becomes the pathway without making it a structure even, that she becomes part of the process if needed?
Chair Jordan, I think that the best way to make sure that the city administrator is part of the process is to continue to include a process in the ordinance that whereby the city administrator, the ordinance committee refers the draft ordinance while it's still in committee to the city administrator for review and consideration. And then it's really up to the city administrator if
So just
he,
remove
she
the
wants
time
to,
requirement.
yeah,
Okay.
he, she wants to consider it and review and comment.
Okay,
But
Great.
can keep that as part of this.
okay, that works for me.
Yeah, and we make it mandatory so that it does have to get referred to the city administrator, and then it's up to the city administrator. That would be the way to, to address that, I think.
And as a follow-up to that, are you recommending those would be written comments? So it would be sent to the city administrator for written comment back to the committee? Or?
Well, that, I think that's up to you, your committee.
This is a perfect example, by the way, of us trying to make an ordinance without
Yeah.
the city administrator, without city administrator input.
You're right, right.
on-
Yeah, it sure
or
would be.
comment on what
nice.
that would,
Yeah.
impact would be.
Maybe, I don't know what level of burden that would put on the city administrator. I mean, I'm certainly sure, requiring written comments might be burdensome on the city administrator.
So just comment, invitation for
Comments,
comment.
Invitation for comments.
Okay,
Yeah.
does that work? Yeah, informal invitation for comment before it's finalized.
Right.
Okay. Because then, of course, after it's finalized, can comment at council.
Council, too.
Has full authority to do that. Okay. Any other follow-up discussion, or, okay. So then I would say, just to summarize those, on the item 2, just that it be advised to the committee before something goes back to council for the significant additional legal research, that we have the opportunity to either curtail that additional research or maybe make a different choice at that point. And then for the city administrator, we went over that one. I think that's clear. And then for the 30-day review deadline, I did have a follow-up on that. So the way it is now is if it's slow, if it's taking forever, the way it is now, a member of the ordinance committee could say, just send it back to council, we're done waiting. Is that basically what that does?
Correct. Yeah, and then it would go at the next regularly scheduled meeting for introduction, whether it's done or not, whether it's ready or not. Or 3 city council members could do the same thing. So it really pushes the process.
Okay, I just want to make clear to the committee members that we're ready to give up that ability. Okay, then we'll give that one up. Okay.
Yeah. Would the committee, I don't exactly know the process here, but would the committee like to see this back? I would kind of like to bring it back so you could see my changes.
I think it would be great to bring it back, and then that would give the city administrator an opportunity to comment.
review. Yes.
Okay, sounds good.
And I'll give a better example than my flippant leaf blower one, and that's the adoption of the street vending ordinance. So that takes place in a vacuum there by the attorney's office.
Right.
But the enforcement is reliant on community development, land use enforcement. And I'm not naive to think that there's probably not a lot of enforcement as to what we adopted going on out in the field, whether there should be or not, whatever persuasion you are there. But I'm sure if the city administrator was involved, she would have raised her hand and said, by the way, you're tasking an ordinance with money that we have not obligated in the budget or people that we have, and you can do that, but that's what I'm here for, is to tell you when when these ordinances and the consequences cross department lines, that we don't have anybody else in here talking about those other departments. Does that make sense?
Totally, quite right, yep.
Okay, thank you. So you have what you need, and I think it would be good for us to see that one back
Yeah,
again.
absolutely,
Thank you.
I'll bring it back.
And then with that, we're ready for the finance ordinance.
I'm going to take a vote on this one. Do you want me to take a vote or no, that you're going to be returning back?
Right, I'm just, it was
gonna
just
come back
referred
with
back to the
Okay.
city attorney's office for further work.
Further
and
review,
If there's a
okay.
concurrence on that,
Just want to make sure.
unless there's an objection.
Yeah, is that suitable if we don't need a motion for that to come back? Or
I don't think so, unless there's an objection,
No.
right?
okay.
You guys are all,
And then just confirming that there was no public comment on that
no
item.
public comment.
Okay, thank you. Ready to move on.
Great, good afternoon. Chair Sneddon, members of the committee, my name is Keith DeMartini, I'm the city's finance director, and it is my pleasure to present an overview of the proposed ordinance establishing the roles and responsibilities of the finance committee. So the agenda for my presentation is to, again, formally establish the committee. I will describe in some level of detail the existing duties of the committee, which are currently already being followed, and just codifying that in an ordinance. We'll talk about the plan to revise some of the city council procedures as it relates to these two ordinances moving forward with their revisions. Talk about next steps and then seek your recommendation, and then of course any questions, public comment, or discussion that you'd like to have. So first and foremost, the city council did adopt a resolution back in 1994, which established the committee, and really it's the term of office. But that resolution did not go into any detail as to sort of the roles and responsibilities of that committee. The ordinance that's before you today does establish the appointment and the term of office. It does designate one council member as the chairperson. And then it also lists the specific duties of the committee, which I will describe on this slide right here. Before I jump into these ones specifically, I will say that the committee is already responsible for reviewing these items. It's really at the discretion of the finance director or the city administrator or staff to bring these items to the committee. And so by codifying these items in an ordinance, it makes it more formal, and it really just adds a higher level of transparency and accountability to ensure that these occur. So first and foremost, any debt financing. And we have one coming up here within the year for the new police facility. Staff will bring the proposed debt issuance item to the Finance Committee for their consideration and then recommendation to the full council. The Finance Committee already reviews any loans that are approved using affordable housing funds. Those will continue as well. Any new or changes to existing departmental fees are already brought to the Finance Committee, and that's a really important part of the city's annual budget process. So that will continue as well. And if there are any changes that staff are proposing to the fees, to the master fee schedule during the operating year, those will also be brought to the Finance Committee. Any consideration of a tax or other revenue generating measure. And so there's been talk of that as of late. I believe when the city went through its very extensive process before Measure C was approved by the voters, there were a number of public meetings held at the Finance Committee for their consideration. That, of course, will continue. Any significant appropriation requests. So there is some subjectiveness to the way this is written. An example of this that occurred within the past fiscal year was the American Rescue Plan Act. So the city did receive two tranches of just over $10 million for each tranche over the past 2 years. Staff brought this item to the Finance Committee, and there was a very robust conversation during the Finance Committee where they gave really specific recommendations for how those funds were to be used. And then those recommendations were brought to the full city council for your consideration. Things like that, really significant, large impact appropriation requests will continue to go to the Finance Committee first. Any budget development topics. So at the beginning of the budget process, when the city administrator issues her budget in April, we have an initial meeting with the Finance Committee and we ask for their opinion. What specific topics would you like to see during the budget process? And oftentimes it's around fees, our revenue assumptions, things like that. So those topics will first be vetted by the Finance Committee before they're brought to the full city council for your request for adoption. And then we have our standard reports that originate from the finance department, that are citywide in nature, that require their review and approval review and recommendation for approval before the full city council. So first is the city's annual comprehensive financial report. It's called the ACFR. Those are our financial statements for the year. Those are always go to finance committee before city council adoption. Also, we have a pretty extensive quarterly financial review process with departments where we revise our revenue projections, our expenditure projections, make sure we're meeting our expenditure reduction targets, any budget adjustments that might be required. Staff delivers a presentation to Finance Committee first, seeking their recommendation before council. And then finally, we issue an annual investment report. There's a presentation that staff delivered to the committee, seeking their recommendation for approval as well. So these are the items, really the duties of the committee that staff would like to codify in an ordinance. So from here on out, there are also some likely changes that staff would be recommending as far as the city council procedures. And so when we are ready to bring both the ordinance committee ordinance and the finance committee ordinance to introduction to the full city council, at that time, we'd also like to bring potential revisions to the city council procedures, asking you to adopt a resolution to that effect. What's come up during this review process with Finance Committee is changing the start time of the meeting. Currently, they both start at 12:30. We'd like to start a little bit earlier, around 12, because some of the items, they do take more than an hour, hour and a half, and we'd like there to be a bit of a break before city council begins at 2. Also, we like to establish the meeting room. For the Finance Committee, it's not currently established anywhere other than just on our website. It will continue to be at the Gebhardt Room. And then there may be some other changes that the committee members would like to communicate to the city attorney or the city administrator to update those procedures as well. So we'd like to take that all into consideration for one complete package when we introduce both ordinances. So we already reviewed this draft ordinance with the Finance Committee about a month and a half ago. They unanimously voted to recommend approval, so that's why we are here before you today. We'll then introduce it when the time is right, when we're all coordinated, and then seek your adoption at a later city council meeting. That concludes my presentation today. So we're seeking your recommendation for approval of the ordinance, and then, of course, take any feedback that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have questions from the committee? Oh, okay, I have a couple. They're quick. For debt financing, I wasn't sure if this covered, sometimes we do the internal loans, like from a department, a large department like the airport, borrowing and then paying back with interest. Does that also go through finance, or is that covered under debt financing?
It's Chair Sneddon. So that wouldn't be a debt financing instrument, but that would be sort of a loan between funds, and absolutely, those items would go before Finance Committee before as
Where
well.
does that fall in this list? I just wanted to make sure it was covered.
Chair Sneddon, that would likely fall under sort of the significant appropriation request item. I would be happy to make that more clear if you would like.
Well, I don't think it's necessary.
okay.
I like that this is simple and
Great.
streamlined. I just had just a couple quick little things to make sure they fell under other things. And then the other question was, these recent deep dives the Finance Committee has been doing, does that fall under budget development topics, or where does that fall as the purview of Finance Committee?
Chair Sneddon, I believe that would fall under sort of budget development topics. I mean, we're not in the budget process yet, but really it's an ongoing process, right? And we're preparing ourselves for the fiscal year 24-25 financial plan, and this is a really important part of that. Also, there's still discretion that the finance director and the city administrator have. If there's a topic that staff believes should go to the Finance Committee, we want to bring it. And so this kind of falls under that category as well.
That sounds good, thank you. And also it came as a direction during budget conversation, so that seems okay.
Yes.
And then the other outstanding question is outside funding requests. This has been something that has been a point of contention, actually, at different times. Is that just not handled by the Finance Committee according to this ordinance, or does it fall under some purview? And if so, I think we need some detail about how it's handled.
Sure. Chair Sneddon, it was about a year ago in preparation for last budget cycle where the Finance Committee asked staff to bring an item to them sort of before the budget process began for options for them to consider for how to handle outside agency requests going forward. At that meeting, I believe it was in October of 2021. At that meeting, the Finance Committee unanimously voted to not move forward with sort of engaging or facilitating an outside agency budget request process for the fiscal year 23 budget, which we just adopted going forward. Instead, the committee asked staff to just kind of rely on the staff's sort of putting together the budget process in conjunction with the city administrator, so that the proposed budget that goes before the city council in April includes any outside agency requests that should be already included in the budget. And there's a number of them. There are already a number of grants that are already appropriated in sort of the baseline budget process. And those are going to be the ones that the Finance Committee, the full City Council will review and consider as part of your budget deliberation process. The Finance Committee voted to not have any additional sort of separate outside agency request process.
Not processed through the Finance Committee.
Correct.
Just want to be really clear. Actually, I think that's a great idea, but so now that I'm clear, so outside funding requests, how are they formally made?
So, Chair Sneddon, there is no formal process. If an agency would like to propose an outside request, it is their responsibility to likely either talk to the department director that sort of oversees those programs, or provide that request directly to the city administrator for her consideration to give direction to staff to include it in the proposed budget.
And if there are council members who wanted to support an outside funding request, what would be the process for that?
Chair Sneddon, my recommendation, if a council member has a request or wants to offer support, is that that is made during the department budget hearing.
Okay, so now we have one process, one place where outside funding requests are funneled through, and that is the public budget hearing process.
Chair Sneddon, that is my recommendation.
Thank you, and that's what this ordinance reflects. It is not listed. I noticed that it's not listed, and I
Yep.
just wanted to make sure that that means it's not.
Chair Sneddon, that is absolutely correct. It's not listed purposefully because there is no process through the Finance Committee.
Perfect. I concur. Okay, any other, is there public comment?
We do not have public comment, Chair Sneddon.
Okay. Then it's to the committee for discussion or motion?
I don't know, you don't need a motion, do you? Just feedback?
Well, I think we want to move this one forward.
Correct, yeah. If you want to move this one forward, you'd want a motion and a vote.
Unless you want to keep them together and we move them both forward together.
You could do that, too.
I don't see that in the recommendation,
Well,
but.
I think we'll want to take them together to council, so if, you could move this one forward and we'll just hold it until the other one's ready to go to council.
Okay, good to go with everything you said, so.
So is that a motion to,
So I'll move the staff recommendation.
Second.
oh, I see. It does say provide feedback to staff in order to introduce the ordinance to city council. So we have done that. That's what you're saying? Yes, we did. Okay. So perhaps we don't need a motion, or it's not
Well,
set up for a
I think
motion?
you've provided the feedback,
provided the
and
feedback.
you're recommending that it be moved to council.
Okay, then we have a motion and a second. Okay, and we'll take a vote.
Okay, so we have an ordinance establishing a standing finance committee. That the ordinance committee will forward the recommendations to council, moved by Councilmember Jordan, second by Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez. Oscar Gutierrez,
Aye.
Councilmember Jordan,
Yes.
Chair Sneddon,
Yes,
thank you.
thank you. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you so much.